I think of it as this like spectrum where like people are either creative or on the business side. And most people are on one end, and that's okay, right? Because I think a lot of creatives beat themselves up by being like, oh, I'm not good at business, blah, blah, blah. But you're good at one side, so like appreciate yourself for that.
On the 81st episode of Passion and Progress, we're talking with the host of Conscious Creators, Sachit Gupta. For years, Sachit has been the person behind the scenes helping some pretty substantial people with their marketing, sales, sponsorships, monetization, and overall growth of audiences. We're talking about people like Tim Ferris, Seth Godin, and Mixergy. If you're a creator or podcaster seeking out sponsorships, we go heavily into that detail in this show. I even talk about what's worked and what hasn't worked in terms of monetization of my own entities as well. And if you are getting value out of this show, if you could please support what I'm doing by sharing it with a friend, another content creator, another entrepreneur, another person that would find the content that I make on this show valuable. I would love you forever if you shared it out with that person. You can tag me at Javier Mercedes X, that's Javier Mercedes X, just like the car. And we even talk about something that I may do if you do share out the podcast and tag me. So without further ado, if you want to hear all about it, let's go ahead and hop into the 81st episode of the Passion and Progress Show with Sachit Gupta. What is up, Mercedes? Javier Mercedes here for yet again another Passion and Progress Show where we talk to inspiring individuals, and hopefully through hearing their stories, you too are motivated to go out and pursue your passion. And on today's show, we are here with Sachit Gupta. How's it going?
It's going well, and I fucking love that intro, by the way. That was amazing.
Thanks, man. You have a podcast out now. It's just started, and you are all about creators and helping creators get that money. Let's go ahead and jump into part of your story, because I love what you do and how you have helped other people, and some pretty significant ones, if that. But I think your story is very interesting. So I don't know if you want to jump off right there, if you want to give a little background of who you are. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll just give a quick background and you can take it wherever you want.
Sure.
I've probably spent now the past decade working with creators. It's funny, I was looking back. It started in college when I used to just read all of these books. Chris Guillebeau's, Tim Ferris, Seth Godin, all of these books. And I was like, man, these people have such an inspiring message. How do I take it to my friends? And I was like, I don't know how to do that. So at that point, TEDx was becoming popular. So me and my friends actually started the first TEDx at our college, Carnegie Mellon. And we emailed all of these guests. And I still remember one of the first ones we emailed was Jonathan Fields, who now has his own podcast. And he first replied with asking for details. And then 3 or 4 hours later, he replied, "Fuck it, I'm in." And we had a Facebook page. And our guests included him, Chris Guillebeau, Chase Jarvis. And in some ways, it's what I'm doing now, which is creating a platform for other creators. And so that was actually the genesis of everything I'm doing now.
Yeah, and you are a person of behind the scenes, and now you're coming to the forefront of, I'm assuming, sharing a lot of expertise of what you've done in the past. With that in mind, do you want to bring up how you got to that point, where you started at, and then how you got to today?
I'll start from right after college. Basically, I ended up working in corporate America. Like probably a lot of your listeners did not like it. Mm-hmm. And after a year, I had to make a choice. Do I keep doing this or do I try something else? And I remember I looked at the person who was like sitting almost like opposite me in the cubicle, and he'd been there like 10 plus years, drove like a nice suburban car. And I was like, if I don't make a move now, that's going to be my life. So I have to make a change. And I actually remember calling my parents. I was like, I quit my job. I could make the safe choice and get another job, or I could go travel. And I'm going to do the smart thing. So I booked a one-way ticket to Bangkok, and they were not happy about that. So I did all of that, and I moved to San Francisco and really just wanted to start a company. I did what I knew best, which just started cold emailing people. And I remember it was almost a year of just cold emailing hundreds of companies, getting all of these interviews, getting meetings, volunteering at conferences, just whatever I could do to be in the right room, and just rejection after rejection.
What was your intention behind that? Were you looking just for like any kind of job, or what was it?
It started with wanting to do marketing consulting.
Okay.
So actually what happened was I quit my job and I was traveling and got into an accident and everything. We can get into that later. But basically it was in India, and another friend of mine emailed me and he was like, hey, I'm starting this thing where I'm going to publish a book in 7 days. Do you want to do marketing? And for me, I was like, wow, I quit my job. I went traveling, and right out of like the sky, like my first consulting client, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, this is going to be really easy. So when I moved to San Francisco, it was actually to start a consulting business because I'd taken a lot of these like courses. And I was like, oh, this is going to be easy. I've already had my first client. So the intention was to get more marketing clients. Looking back in hindsight, what I realized was I was really good at marketing, which is getting meetings with people and getting in front of the right people. But once I got in front of them, the sales part, I had no idea. And it took a lot of years to learn that.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned an accident. What was that?
And I haven't shared this part of the story. So when I traveled, first I went to Bangkok and I'd booked like travel insurance and was in Bangkok for about a month. And then that expired. So I was like, I've never needed it. I'm not going to renew.
Oh, no.
So from there, I flew to Bali and I met this dude in Bangkok and randomly ran into him in Bali. And he was like, hey, I'm going there too. How are you getting there? I'm like, I'm going to go take a bus. He's like, I'm just driving on a bike. Just sit behind me. And I'm like, okay, sounds smart. So it's literally like him, his backpack, me, my backpack. We're driving and we're almost there. And like he makes a turn and the bike just slips. I fall off. And then I get up and I'm like, okay, I'm okay. And then I try and like do this, trying to get my hand to my shoulder and it doesn't get there. Like, oh crap, I've dislocated my shoulder. That was the accident. And I'm in a country where I don't know anyone. I didn't even have a hotel room booked where we went that night.
Yeah.
So like that wasn't there. And I was like, okay, what do I do?
With no insurance whatsoever.
No insurance. So all of these people came to help. And it was funny. One guy took me to this clinic and I remember I took off my t-shirt so they could like look. I had 2 bags, one with clothes, one with my like laptop and stuff. So they're like, okay, this is bad. We're going to take you to the hospital. So I left my bag with the clothes there. Just have my laptop bag with me and they drive me to the hospital. We get to the hospital and they're like, oh yeah, the doctor's like 2 hours away. I'm sitting there like waiting for the doctor. And once the doctor comes, they're like, it's going to be like $2,000 or something. Cause they're just like kid from the US.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't have insurance. So I'm literally negotiating with them there.
This is where the sales comes in.
Yeah, because I'm like, I'm not going to pay $2,000 and I know you guys are overcharging me. And that other person who had driven with me, he comes to me and goes, dude, you don't need to do this. Just come outside, put your hand over a chair and I'll just knock it back in.
Oh no.
I'm like, I'm not going to do that.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So I finally like negotiated them down a bit. And then like they put me under anesthesia. I got back up and it was back. And I think maybe he talked to them or something, or maybe they just had pity. And so they charged me a little less than that. So I think it was like $500 or $1,000, which still I think they were overcharging me. Mm-hmm. But we finally get out of there at 1. And then he's like, all right, you want to head back? I'm like, cool. And I have to sit back on that bike. I'm like, oh man. Sit back on the bike. He took me to this like hotel I knew about. And literally like at 1 a.m. I go in there, book a hotel room and crash. And the next morning I wake up, I'm like, oh, I don't have my clothes. So I go back to that clinic we had gone to and like, then they're like, oh yeah, it's going to be this much. What the hell? And so I'm on the phone with the guy who runs the clinic and they go like being like, you guys are overcharging me. He literally goes, he's like, I'm going to call the cops. I'm like, no, don't do that. And finally like agreed to an amount, got my backpack because it was still there. And finally that was done.
So trial by fire with the whole negotiation. Yeah. Do you want to speed that up to how you got more of your sales experience and marrying that to getting in front of the right people?
So from there, like I did all that, moved to San Francisco, basically spent a year getting all of these meetings. One of those meetings was with Andrew Warner, who runs a podcast called Mixergy. And basically we did a project first, didn't work. And I just kept like being in front of him and eventually like ended up working with him on a project, which led to another project. And I think actually the biggest thing I learned from that was I'm good at what I do. I'm not good at talking about it. Mm-hmm. So from there, what I would do with clients is just try and work for free. Because if they could see my skill set, then maybe they'll want to hire me for something else, right? Mm-hmm. So with Andrew, I was like, just hire me for a project. I'll do it for free. He hired me and then actually ended up paying me. And that was $200 for the first one. And then he still said, my company isn't ready for you. So a year later, he was doing something else, invited me and then was like, can I hire you for a day? I was like, yeah, we'll worry about prices later. Just hire, let me know what it is. So he hired me for a day that turned into 2 weeks and we're still, like, he's still a client. Speeding up to like the podcasting thing, basically, I was doing all of these projects and I remember looking at it in 2015, I was helping him with sponsorships. I was building websites for someone. I was doing Infusionsoft work. I was running Facebook ads for someone else. I was launching a music video in India. I was working with a ball bearing company and I'm like, I have no idea, like it's just so broad, right? I was at a mastermind and this guy was like, everyone needs to pick a niche. And I like podcasting, so I just picked that niche. And basically I came back from that, and just started emailing people being like, hey, I'm working with podcasters, or podcasters and creators doing this. Who do you know? One of my friends was like, hey, have you worked with Tim Ferris? It's like, no, but can you connect us? And he actually offered to introduce me. So I sent him an intro email and I was like, don't send it yet because I'm not ready. A month later, somehow, now I know what happened, but all these things connected where I basically woke up to an email in my inbox, inquiry from Tim Ferris.
So he probably sent it anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, no, he didn't send it. What happened was, and a lot of this actually goes back to this guy, Charlie Hoehn, who also used to live in Austin. In 2009, he published this book called Recession Proof Graduate, which is basically his story of how he used this concept of free work to work with Ramit Sethi, Tim Ferris, Tucker Max, and all of these people. And literally all I did when I worked with Andrew was copied his email script, send it to Andrew, and that's how I got my first work with Andrew, right? So I just kept Charlie updated on what I had been doing. And I think a few years later, maybe Tim reached out to him and was like, hey, I want to hire someone like you. Who do you recommend? And Charlie recommended me. And I think this goes to the power of a lot of people think these things happen instantly, or people are playing the short game. I had emailed Charlie back in 2010, and it was 5 years later till when that happened, right? So it was just, I think it was more about investing in the right relationships and just adding value to people and not expecting anything back and doing that over the long term. So people in the industry can see you and know who you are.
And you mentioned an email script. Is this something that you paid for? Is it a part of the book or what?
I think it's included in the book.
What book is that?
Recession Proof Graduate. You can find it on Amazon. And I don't know why Charlie does it, but I think actually if you go to his website, charliehoehn.com, if you put in your email, you actually get both his books for free.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And, and literally this book is the playbook for what I did and how I got to where I am.
Okay, so if people really want to dive into how and what worked, read those.
Yeah.
So you got the meeting with Tim. What did you do for him, or how was that first iteration? Because I'm assuming, especially with what's the Mixergy. With Mixergy, I feel like you already had the ball rolling. And then when you're with Tim, how does that start snowballing?
Yeah. So I can't share specifics about the work that I did.
Okay.
But basically it was just really we met in person, and I'll share the framework of what I always do in a meeting like this, right? It's a lot of people try and sell what they're doing. I always start by just learning about what he's doing and what his problems are. And going in with that mindset that you're going to be a trusted advisor. So if I can't solve that problem, I'll recommend someone else because I'm trying to build that relationship over the long term. In his case, we found something in his business that I could help with, and I wasn't completely sure if I could do it. So we basically were like, okay, let's do an audit and we'll look at it and I'll tell you what I would do and present that to his team, and his team liked that, and that just turned into a relationship for 3 years. So it's basically running a lot of paid media and growing his audience, working on 2 book launches, and just an incredible experience.
Speaking of book launches, there was a video that I came across the other day where it's just Tim Ferris staring at the camera or for those that are just listening, it's the whole frame is taken up by his eyes, and he stares at the camera for 3 minutes, and then he just holds up his book at the end of it. I thought it was pretty funny, and a good way to just kind of build some press around the book. Mm-hmm. But so you did stuff for Tim Ferris, and then I'm assuming you were getting more people knocking on your door for your services. How did that look afterwards?
Well, it wasn't actually that, because at that point I was still not very public.
Mm-hmm.
And also I couldn't really talk about most of the work I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been an interesting challenge, right? Most of the projects I did, I couldn't talk about, and still I can't talk about a lot of them. What I got good at was leveraging one thing to the next. So in the same way, while I was working with Tim, I saw Seth's team through the Alt MBA project was running Facebook ads. And I looked at one of their ads and I was like, I think I could do better. And the same way I built a relationship with Charlie, back in college, Seth had launched this thing called the Domino Project. I was working at GE, and December of 2010, he did this post being like, hey, these are the people I've picked to be part of that project. One of them was Willie Jackson. And I was like, how do you work with Seth? So I basically cold emailed him like, hey, I saw that you got picked. How did you do it? Would you hop on a call? And he hopped on a call, and I just kept a relationship with him. So he was helping Seth with the Alt MBA, and I sent him an email, hey, you guys are doing Facebook ads. I think I can do better. These are the people I'm working with. Let me know if I can help. And so that got me connected to his team. And I still remember I did a call with the director of the program, and she was like, hey, we're not looking to hire anyone for this. we would just love to learn from you. If you want to do that, how do you charge? And I was like, don't pay me anything up front. We'll do like 2 calls because of like Seth's work has had this impact on me. And I'll just help you guys. And then after 2 calls, we can decide. So we do 2 calls and I just show them everything I do, what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong. And at the end of the 2 calls, they go, well, can we just hire you for this? Like, done. So it's sort of that same framework of just reaching out to someone who I've built a relationship with, adding value up front before being like, this is what I charge, and just showing my skill set and then seeing where things go.
How often has that burned you? I'm only asking because I feel like people in the audience will be like, oh, how much work do I have to do for free in order to do the things?
Yeah. No, I mean, I've definitely like worked with people where I've given them advice and nothing has happened. In some cases, I've given advice to people and they've gone on to just like go like this. And it's like...
He's showing a skyrocket.
Yeah, and you don't hear anything back. But I think...
Oh, so they took your advice and they didn't even pay you for it. And then they did amazing things with it.
Yeah, and I think that's okay because what I would rather focus on is like the times that has worked. And in the moment that has felt bad, but I realize if that's what happened with those people, do you actually want to work with them? Like, would they be the good clients, right? Because if they're not thankful for something you helped them with, they're not going to be good clients. The people I have helped and it's worked, they've been clients and friends forever. So even if I worked with someone for 1 or 2 years, I still have a relationship with them.
Sounds great.
Actually, I'll give you another example that happened 2 days ago. I worked with someone for a project for about like 2 months where I was doing sponsorship for an event. It didn't really work out. We were kind of like exploring and I was going to charge him, let's say like X amount. But after the project was done, I didn't really feel like I delivered. So I just didn't send him the second invoice. So I was like, well, I didn't deliver. What's the point? This has been 4 years now. A friend of mine just started working with that person and sent me a message the other day. He's like, yeah, your name came up. And he was telling that story. So he is still telling people that story about like how I worked with Sachit. He didn't charge me. Like, and that shows his character, right? So like sometimes those stories and doing things the right way is more important than whatever money you make.
Always doing the right thing or what is believed to be the right thing will carry across many years.
There's a quote from Warren Buffett. It takes a lifetime to build a reputation and it takes 5 minutes to ruin it.
Yeah.
And I think most people in our world where like everything's like short term, everyone wants the clicks and all, forget that. And people burn their audiences, people burn relationships and are just thinking on the short term.
Is there anything that you can share to people listening for the sales part? And this is a very big thing in the creator community. I think that, especially myself, like I want to be creative. I want to make videos. I want to do podcasts and everything. But the whole sales part, just like what you were talking about in the very beginning of your journey, is like, I don't know how to do that as well. Trust me, when the rubber hits the road and now like we have a mortgage and all this other stuff, like I'm definitely coming more up to par on sales and other things of that nature. What advice would you be able to give?
I think of it as this like spectrum where like people are either creative or on the business side. Mm-hmm. And most people are on one end, and that's okay, right? Because I think a lot of creatives beat themselves up by being like, oh, I'm not good at business, blah, blah, blah. But you're good at one side, so like appreciate yourself for that. The second thing is, I think people make it very complicated. Like the biggest things I hear is creatives don't want to be salesy. They don't want to deal with like complicated funnels and webinars and all of this stuff that all the marketers are telling you to use, right? And they basically they want to do things that feel good in alignment without being salesy to your audience. So kind of like holding those principles. Actually, before we go into it, like I'm curious, like what all have you tried and
sure.
And what's worked and what hasn't worked?
If you use me as a case study, you know what's interesting is one of my listeners pointed out that like people on my podcast, it's basically like I just get free like workshops. So
that's one of the best reasons to do it.
Yeah. So just recently I hit 10,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel, which allows you to sell merch. And before that, I set up the merch in alignment for hitting that. So now I have my Passion and Progress merch line. I have affiliate marketing, YouTube ad sales, or just AdSense from that. I have a Patreon, and my product that I sell right now is a preset pack for Premiere Pro, which it's like when I first launched that thing, it was like, here's a dedicated video to it. And then now I probably talked about it in the ads before this podcast, but it's awesome to wake up and then be like, oh, somebody bought it. And then like, oh, another person bought it like this time. It's like really weird to me how that happens.
Congratulations for doing that first.
Yeah. And then now my big thing is, and you actually just brought this up right beforehand, is every single time somebody comes in here or I go and talk to somebody else, video podcasting always comes up. So now I've been talking about, I gave a talk a month ago at Galvanize about video podcasting, and now I'm creating a video podcasting course. So my next big project is to create a course.
And so like what's worked, how well has it worked, if you can share
sure,
numbers or anything we can share.
I will say in terms of money coming in, Google AdSense and affiliate marketing for Amazon stuff is the number one. Now in grand scheme of things that are paying bills and all that stuff, all of my YouTube creator-esque money pales in comparison of what I make doing freelance work. So right now, obviously, to me, what I want to do is get to the point where all of the YouTube creation and podcasting, all that stuff creates the cash flow. But I would say all of the YouTube stuff, like everything that I talked about underneath that umbrella, is maybe like 10% of my income right now. Right. But I've been going at it hard for like a year, and before it was zero. So now I'm just happy that it's like, I can see it growing, and I can see where it can go exponentially.
And is the freelance stuff that you're doing connected with?
It's video editing. So video editing.
So it's separate from the work you're doing with the podcast and everything?
In a way, yes. I would say a lot of other contacts I've gotten like lead. I guess the podcast would be a lead magnet to other people and editing for other people. Like I got a gig doing editing for CBS, and then I did a gig for ESPN just from somebody that I interviewed on the podcast. But like I said, so that is kind of podcast revenue still, right? It like came from the podcast. Yeah, I guess, for sure. That wouldn't have happened if I wouldn't have had the prior conversations with the people that I was talking to on the show, and the other people that I was working with have now been guests on the show.
Yeah, so I'll give you my framework for thinking about it. For whenever I work with someone with an audience, right? Like the first thing is, have you seen that thing where it's like, if you want to make $1 million, you can sell to one person a product for $1 million, or 10 people for 100,000. Or 100 people for 10,000.
Yeah.
So deciding that, I think, is the most important thing. Is, do you want to have a few clients and charge them a lot, or do you want to have a lot of customers and charge them a little? And I think most people don't even think about that. Yeah.
When I made my first product, in my mind, when I look at the product, I'm like, this is a very easy preset. Like somebody can do this very easy in Premiere Pro. I'm just making it just a tad bit easier to save people time. So I believe that product is not worth like a whole bunch of money. But when I come up with my video podcasting course, it's like, this is as much information that I can brain dump into a thing. So I know when it comes to that mindset, like that will be a much higher cost thing.
Yeah. So actually, on that, what you're talking about is like, how do you price, right? Because I think a lot of people will price on time. So they're like, yeah, I spent like 10 hours on this, so I can't charge more than like $20 or whatever. But have you heard that Picasso story where he was I think, or Picasso or some artist, but the point still stands. He's sitting in a cafe and he just like draws something, and someone goes, or he like draws something and like throws it in the trash. Someone was like, hey, can I have that painting? And he goes, yeah, it's $10,000. They're like, but that took you 2 minutes. And he's like, yeah, but it took me 20 years to learn how to do this, right? So I think another thing like mistake people make is they price on time instead of value. So for me, I think one of the smartest things I did when I started doing sponsorships, I said, just give me a percentage, right? So I can spend, let's say like an hour renewing a sponsor deal that's, let's say $50,000. If someone was charging like on dollars, 2 hours, $500 an hour, $1,000, right? But if you do a percentage, let's say it's like 20%, that's a lot more. So really like deciding, are you pricing on value or time? Because let's say you do like the podcasting course, right? Maybe someone takes like 10 hours to set it up, but what is the value to them? Like what would be a value to someone learning how to do that and being able to do that.
So it would extremely cut down on the amount of Googling that you would have to do in order to not only that, but then giving them the framework of whatever your budget is, here is the specific kind of gear. If you're starting out, here's what I would recommend for whatever price.
What were you thinking of pricing it as?
I don't know yet. I have no idea.
I think most things, if you position them the right way, you can charge thousands. And then kind of like going back to that point of like how many customers do you want, right? You could sell that, but you could also charge someone $5,000 to just come and do it for them. Because a lot of people just don't want to deal with it, right? Like there's companies I know that want to start podcasting and don't want to deal with it. And they're paying other companies tens of thousands of dollars to just do that.
To set it up.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. There was another person that I just did another podcast with that we talked about after the podcast. And he was like, you could sell it at a certain price point, and then that could be the introductory thing. But the higher ticket thing is at the end, you actually sell like having time with you to actually go through and talk about, all right, this is what I would recommend, and have a on a case by case basis type of thing. Yeah.
The way I think about it is like you give someone the instruction manual, that's one price point. Then they get access to you, that's another price point. They get access to community, which is a different price point, and then you just do it for them. So just like having that ladder is really helpful. Because like, I mean, let's say it's like a company, right? Like, and they're trying to get into content. They want to figure all of this out. They don't have time. If you sell it the right way, they'll pay tens of thousands of dollars for you to come and just set up a studio for them.
Yeah. As I never even thought about that. One thing that I know that you have the specialty in, and since I kind of want to segue this in just because like I don't have it on my channel, but sponsorships, how would you approach that? Is there, and the way that I think about it is to me, it was intimidating at first when you open up a syndication service like Libsyn. And for those that don't know, when you create a podcast, you have to, it's not that you have to, but when people publish their podcasts, what happens is you upload it to a syndication service. And what that is the one-stop shop to put your file on, and then that website or service distributes that to all of the different podcatchers. So Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, so on and so forth, Google Podcasts and all that stuff. But in Libsyn, they have a thing where it's like if you get 20,000 downloads per month, then you can just opt into their sponsorship like pool. And then they just send you emails and like, do you want to read the reads for this sponsor or not? And then it's like to see the number of 20,000 downloads in the beginning as a podcaster is like really intimidating. And I heard that maybe not even like 5% of podcasts get to that point. So that's like a select few that are even in that pool.
Right.
And I know that's not the case for a lot of podcasts. They're not getting 20,000 downloads per a month when they first start their sponsorships. So where do you begin? How do you approach that?
Yeah. So I think for most podcasters, even before sponsorships or partnerships, what they should actually look at is who is their audience? What do they want? And can you actually create a product or service or something around coaching to sell to your current audience? Yeah. So I think like that's one thing. So I'll share have done sponsorship for a bigger podcast and how I'm thinking about it for myself. So like when I work for a bigger podcast that obviously has downloads, usually sponsorship is done on per CPM basis, right? Like $1,000.
Can you explain to what?
Yeah, so it's like if you get 1,000 downloads, if it's 25 CPM, you get $25.
Cost per milli is what he's referencing.
Yeah. And I think that's
even though milli is like 1,000, but yeah.
And so that's how like most podcasts do it. I started doing sponsorship for Mixergy, and I looked at the prices and I was like, this is insane. Because let's say you're advertising on someone's Instagram account for like a car service, right? For a fancy car. One account is like Brad Pitt, who has 1 million fans, and one account is some shitty account that also has 1 million fans. You're not going to pay the same price to advertise on both because one's audience is way better, right? So I just had that instinct and I was like, we should be charging more. So I remember Andrew, who runs it, was charging a certain amount. I went to our first sponsor and I was like, let's not look at the CPMs. Like how much are you willing to pay for a customer? And they told me the number and I was like, okay, like I think we can get you these many customers a month. Does that make sense? He's like, yeah. So I'm like, okay, that times that is equal to this amount. does that seem fair? And he was like, yeah, that seems fair. And in that conversation, we basically doubled the prices. So again,
and this is somebody that was already paying a specific amount.
It was a new sponsor.
Okay, I was like, oh man, that's ballsy to go to another.
I would try with so in that actually thing is, in your question is, if you're changing pricing, try with a new customer, and if they say yes, then you can go back to your previous customers and either be like, hey, we're changing pricing, this is the new pricing, or tell them, hey, we're going to change our pricing. You've been a customer for this long, so I'll offer you the previous pricing if you buy for 6 months.
I gotcha.
So that's what I would do to just get money up front, right? So there's always like ways you can play with that. Because at the end of the day, we're all making this up.
Yeah.
There's no like one set thing. So that's how I did sponsorship for Mixergy. What I'm doing for myself, I'm starting a podcast. I have 0 downloads, right? I think one mistake people make is, or there's 2 things. One is thinking that the only way you can partner with someone is money. So what I'm actually doing is I'm going to a lot of these sponsors. I'm like, I'm kind of like opening the kimono here because this is going to be interesting to see how it works. First is, if you have a sponsor, you actually position yourself differently from other podcasts, right? Mm-hmm. So for mine, I'm actually going to a lot of sponsors I've worked with in the past and being like, do you want to sponsor my podcast? The total cost is going to be, guess what? $0. Because if I launch with podcast or with sponsors already, it positions me differently, right? The other thing I'm doing, and I actually learned this from this book called Powerhouse CAA, which is about how movies are made in Hollywood. So they were talking about how when they made Ghostbusters, they didn't have huge budgets up front. So they basically went to all of these actors and were like, hey, you charge like 10 million or whatever, take 1 million, but we'll give you percentage points on the back end. So if the movie goes big, you'll make more. And we all know what happened with Ghostbusters, right? They all made a lot more money on the back end than the front end. So what I'm going to do with sponsors is 0 up front. It helps me with positioning, and then give me a percentage of whatever you make on the back end.
I gotcha. So it's affiliate marketing.
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah, basically. Okay.
And then basically it incentivizes them to also promote the episodes, because as the episodes go bigger, they get more customers. Mm-hmm. So I think people aren't really creative with this stuff. Like they just look at one model and test it. So I think this is a way that podcasting sponsorship could change. I think the other thing is, let's say you have a podcast with a small audience, that's a very niche audience, right? Let's say you cater to software developers, for example, and you get 1,000 downloads a month. There's a lot of so companies that hire, or recruitment companies, get paid a lot of money for taking developers from one company to the other, right? With like recruiting bonuses. So you could actually, if a company is willing to pay a higher amount per customer, you could charge them a lot for reaching software developers. So the other thing I look for is, who are people within the network of what you're doing that are willing to pay a much higher premium for one person. And I have to go after those companies instead of someone who's just selling a widget to your audience.
Yeah, a good case in point of that is there. I saw a YouTube video once where, speaking of CPMs, one guy was like a lawyer or something like that, and the normal CPM on like a normal whatever Google AdSense thing is like half of a cent or less than that. But because one person clicked through on a certain lawyer ad, the guy got like a $500 check just because of selling one thing off the beginning of his video. Case in point.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I try to do is, like, I think a lot of these services that are just like mass ads, they don't care about your audience. They're just selling like inventory based on CPM, right? So I personally like doing more of these custom long-term deals, because even with Mixergy, the first 2 sponsors that we worked with back in 2015 when I started are still sponsors. So they're still sponsoring 5 years later because we've kept that relationship and we've built that relationship.
Yeah, so that was like a huge knowledge bomb in terms of how do you even approach sponsorship for a podcast.
I'll add 2 other things on that, which is, if you're trying to figure out who would be a good sponsor, most people are like, oh yeah, I want this company, no one cares, right?
It's more about your audience, isn't it?
Yeah. So look at your expenses and see what you're already paying for. And then go to your audience and be like, hey, what are you guys already paying for? Because that gives you an idea of things your audience is willing to pay for. And then you can either go to those companies already or go to companies that are similar and be like, hey, this is my audience, this is what they care about. These would be good, you would be a good sponsor. And really like have a match between the sponsor and audience, because I'm sure you've listened to podcasts where someone's reading an ad and you're like, he doesn't give a fuck about that product, right? Because he's just like reading something. You know it, your audience knows it, and then it just. I think a podcaster's recommendation is as good as the weakest sponsor, because if your audience, your audience at any point is like, this guy's just doing it for the money, they're going to think the same of all the other sponsors. So the other thing with Mixergy we do is we say to a lot of companies. Like companies will come to us and they're like, we're ready to sponsor, here's the money. I'm like, no, wait, let's figure out if there's a fit. Because if there isn't a fit with the audience, like they can offer us $1 million and we'll say no.
Yeah, I think that was one of the big things when I was coming up with my product. One, it was really hard to build something that wasn't already out there in terms of a preset for video editing software. But after I built it, every single time I do the read, I do it specific to each episode, because one, each time I do a new read or I promote it again, more people have given me more feedback about how it's helped them out. And I'm like, look, I use this thing every single day.
Are you including those stories in your ads?
Just by you looking at your website, now I'm like, hey, can I use this? Or hey, can I use that? So now I am.
Yeah. So one of my favorite books is Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Cialdini or whatever. Yeah. And we try and incorporate all of those elements into our ads, like social proof, reciprocity. So like one of the things I know Andrew says.
What does reciprocity mean?
So if basically, like if you've done a favor for someone, they're more likely to do a favor for you. Just that, right? So like we tell people, we're like, hey, look, these sponsors are making this podcast possible. So if you like the podcast, go buy this product from the sponsor if it's a good fit for you.
Gotcha.
And I forget what all the other elements are, but that book is just, you can search Influence, Psychology of Persuasion summary. There's like, I think like 7 or 8 principles. So anytime I'm doing a marketing campaign, try and incorporate all of them, especially social proof.
That's awesome. And I could personally attest to this, because if you were to go to his website, you see all of those testimonials. And like by the time you get to the second or third one, you're like, man, I need this service. This is great, you know? With that being said, though, how do you decide who to work with and who not to work with? Because I'm assuming you're at a point now, just like what you were talking about with sponsors. How do you say no?
When I started, like I said, like I basically said yes to everything, right? Like I was doing all of these different
Which
projects.
I assume is a good, just to see what works for yourself.
And I think, because I think this answer is very specific to me. In that framework of like how many clients do you want and all of this stuff, I'm introverted. I don't like building a massive team. So I just knew that I wouldn't work with more than like 4 to 5 clients at a time. So initially it was just going after clients I was inspired by. Like every person I worked with, I was listening to Mixergy back in college. I read Tim's book back in like, when I was in a cubicle at Bank of America. I read Seth's book when I first moved to the US and learned marketing. So it was just people I was inspired by. And now what I look for is, and it's more of a gut decision, do I think this thing is making a difference in the world? Because if it is, then I want to put like my machine of like everything I've learned behind it. And if it isn't creating a positive impact in the world, I just don't want to work with it.
Gotcha.
So now it's gone to that point, but definitely when I started out, it wasn't that.
One of the things that I learned just from listening to a lot of your testimonials is that you're really good at pinpointing, like, look, this is what's working, this is what's not working. How do you go about approaching, all right, get rid of all of this and then just start doing this thing or focus down on that? I know it's a case-by-case basis, but if there's any kind of story.
I think honestly a lot of it is like, we always know. We're like hiding from it, right? Like it's like, I remember the clients that didn't work out. And if I'm really honest with myself, when I was talking to them initially, before we agreed and all of that, there was that little voice being like, this is not the right fit.
I got you.
And most of the times that's there and we don't listen to it. So a lot of those for me just have been like gut decisions where I'm like, this just doesn't feel right. But also I think it's like, it's easy for me to say that now because I have that choice. When you're starting out and when you're just trying to like make money to pay rent, that's really hard to do. And I remember those cases and like, I took on clients that didn't make sense and it was good to pay the bills and it helped me at that point. And now if I go back, I probably wouldn't say yes to those.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is also making mistakes because you learn where your limits are.
You are a person that was behind the scenes and you're coming to the forefront. How's it been? It's
been really interesting. It started off by publishing that story that you saw. And it's funny because even that, like I sat on it for 2 months. I got really good feedback on it. And then I was like, oh, I want to share more of that story. So I did a few podcasts and then it's funny. I tried to get on a few other podcasts and they were like, oh, maybe not, maybe. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to make my own. In the last month, I met someone who's helping me produce it. I recorded my first one on Friday. I think the biggest thing actually has been I understand what my clients go through way more. So in terms of like customer development, I'm like, I should have done this like 5 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Because I can tell someone like, oh, do this interview, record this, like make it fast. And then when you're actually like doing the interview and you're trying to schedule and all of these different things, like, oh, okay, this is what they go through.
Yeah.
So it's just like a great learning exercise. Interviewing people has been interesting. I thought it would have been much harder than it was. But I think that's because I've probably just been like secretly like just like reverse engineering what people do, and being around all of these podcasters that I work with, I got the best education in how to ask good questions. So yeah, it's been interesting and I'm excited to see where it goes.
So with that in mind, how have you approached your interviews? Do you have stuff set out? Do you have bullet points? Do you do research? How does that all look? So
the first one I did, and probably the first few I'm doing, are with like people I already know. I wanted to like script out every question. Mm-hmm. Then I was like, no, this is going to be too much. So the first one was actually with this performance coach I've worked with, who worked with like Metallica, Rage Against the Machine, all these artists.
Wow.
And part of our work, he had sent me the song that he had written and sang. So the interview was literally like me writing down my 4 favorite lyrics from the song. Mm-hmm. And I read the first lyric and asked him a question, only got to 2 of them, and just like, with him though, the conversation just goes wherever. Yeah. So I'm just going to test that. Like start with, actually, my friend Raj, who has the Stay Grounded podcast and is still in Austin, he told me what he does is he knows something about the guest, starts with one question scripted, and then just goes from there. That's kind of what I do. I'm trying that. I also know the other side where like when I work with Mixergy, every person who gets interviewed does a pre-interview, and then there's a whole document in that, and then Andrew starts with that. But I just don't even have the bandwidth to do that. With what you were talking about, mm-hmm. with writing out those lyrics and everything, when I started out, I'd say my first 10 to 15 episodes, I got to writing bullet points, and I mm-hmm. noticed that I could not get past a page of bullet points if I wrote them down. And then it got to the point where I was since I do all of my podcasts in person, I remember this specifically. I was in Denver, Colorado, mm-hmm. and somebody reached out and they said, hey, you should go interview this one person. It was a great opportunity to go interview that person. Mm-hmm. I didn't know diddly squat or anything about it. Right. And I was like, okay, if I was some person, how would I approach this and what would I want to know about their profession? Mm-hmm. So I just went into it, and then I just started asking questions, and then like by trial by fire, going into them, it was much easier stress-wise to approach the conversations with, all right, I know I have a couple questions that I want to ask, mm-hmm. and then where does the conversation lead from there? And plus it opens it up to much deeper evaluation mm-hmm. on each topic. In terms of principle, I think people want to hear conversations. Mm-hmm. Actually, going back to one of your earlier questions about monetization, all those testimonials that you saw, there's one thing in common, which is I realize most people who have an audience are just talking at their audience. They're not talking to their audience. Mm-hmm. So one of the first things I tell clients to do is go to your audience, do like some sort of like survey and ask them questions, and then tell people, I'll literally pick people to call and have conversations with them. So every client, I'm like, okay, first week, at least 5 people in your audience, you're going to actually like have phone conversations with them, mm-hmm. right? Because it just changes the dynamic. And I think like people want to hear conversations. And I think not starting with any bullets is actually a really great exercise in cultivating presence, because you have to like really actually like listen for the next question. One of my favorite late night show hosts was Craig Ferguson. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen his stuff, but he would basically show up, he would have his note cards, and then before he started the interview, he would tear it and throw it and then just talk. And I've learned a lot from just watching him. Mm-hmm. And ideally, I would want to move in that direction. Yeah, I think that's the most stress-free version. The other mm-hmm. thing too with that is if you, just from listening to you, you have a lot of background in reading books, obviously mm-hmm. surrounding yourself with the different people already high level in the medium. Mm-hmm. So when you know their theories behind certain worth ethics and other things of that nature, mm-hmm. just elaborating on other things that you've heard comes up in podcast conversations all the time. I find it's really weird how it happens, but I'll be listening to the Gold Digger podcast one mm-hmm. week, and it just happened on an interview that I just had.
I was listening to a podcast that morning, and then the woman that I was interviewing started talking about the same exact concept that Jenna, the host of the Gold Digger podcast, was talking about. And I was like, oh, let's go ahead and talk about this piece of information now, which is crazy because then you can have a deep, meaningful conversation just like between two people of like, oh, I really wanted to ask somebody about this. Good thing we're right here with two microphones in front of our faces to talk about it, which I think if there was a bullet pointed list of benefits of doing a podcast, that's one of them.
Yeah, I think people are craving for just real conversations. And I think one thing you said that actually, that's probably true is I've probably learned and picked up a lot that I don't even know that's going to come out by just being around other podcasters. Yeah, I'm extremely grateful for that education because I remember when I worked with Andrew initially, I worked in his office and I would see him do interviews and I'd be like, wait, why did you ask that? Why did you ask it this way? So I think I was just trying to learn more about it. And this actually reminds me of just how important curiosity is. Yeah. Because one story I remember from the book Powerhouses, when Tom Cruise started acting, I remember they tell the whole story of like how they found him and stuff. He would go on set and he wanted to talk to every person. Like he wanted to talk to the camera person, the voice person, all of these person. And he would just be like, hey, can I learn more about what you do? And I think like having that curiosity is super helpful because you just are learning about different things.
Yeah. So I used to be the audio engineer for the Chive podcast and our third podcast, and we got to do Mark Cuban. And we went to Mark. That is amazing. Yeah, it was. The reason I bring it up though is because we went to Dallas, and he has his own. You could call it an office. It's basically like an amazing man cave where he probably gets like a lot of his work done. But it's right courtside. And one of the coolest things I'll say is if you ever hear anything about Mark Cuban being really cool, trust me, it's true. In the room, I'm the audio engineer. I'm in the back of the room, just like making sure everything's working all right. But the way that Mark Cuban treats everybody while he's in the room is he's having the conversation with the two hosts, but he's making the same amount of eye contact with me and involving me in the conversation. And then afterwards, he talks to everybody that's in the room. Like when we moved, when we first went to that room, like you could tell that the security guard that was escorting us like spoke very highly of him. And I think this also gets way back to one of the first concepts you brought up of like playing a long game of like just being nice or doing the right thing. But I think in his case, he's not doing it from a business sense. I think he's just doing it because he's like, that's who he is. He wants to be a nice dude.
Yeah. I think it's just so important to be nice to everyone. I actually remember asking Andrew about this because Andrew would get so many emails when I first started working with him. Like I remember actually one instance where we sat down to work. I looked at his inbox and he had like X number of emails. I saw him do it for an hour. I look back and it's like same number of emails or even more because he just had like all these people emailing him, right? I'm like, why do you respond to everyone? And he goes, because one of these people could be a founder I want to interview in 5 years. So I have to. And I think the other thing that people don't realize is a lot of people want to meet famous people, right? Like you'll go to events and everyone's trying to take photo with the person. This is one of the biggest things I learned initially. And I think, forget where I either read it somewhere or just came up with it, was most of those famous people have their like generals around them who they trust, right? So like when they're trying to solve a problem, that's who they turn to. So when people go to events, they're trying to meet the famous person. I'm trying to meet the people who work with them.
Look at this hot tip.
Right? Because if you can build a relationship with that person, when they're like, oh, who do you know for this? Oh, I met this guy. He made me feel important at this event. So that's who they're going to recommend you. So I think, it's just looking at everything from a different angle.
That's like the Facebook technique of, so when Facebook started out, you know, how they couldn't get into certain colleges. So what they did is they started to release Facebook in different colleges surrounding that one college until all of the friends of the people that went to the main college were like, whoa, everybody else is on this. Why aren't we on it? And then the FOMO starts. There's two questions I ask at the end of each podcast, but one of the main things that I think the audience would just want me to ask, is there any other big all-encompassing marketing thing that you would want to bring up or talk about that is a barrier to entry for creators?
I think the most important marketing thing that I can tell is understanding who you're talking to. Like really just like getting into the minds of your customers. Like most people you can look up like customer avatars and stuff, like, and people think it's like, oh, it's already done, but like getting those fundamentals right is so important. And I think most people miss that. Like most people are like, oh, I want the latest webinar trick or the Facebook ads trick. Guess what? If you don't have the fundamentals right, like you're going to just burn money on Facebook, because I've seen clients do that. So yeah, I think it would just be go back to the fundamentals and get those right, because that influences everything else.
And one thing to actually do that would be those phone calls that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, just go talk to people. Like call your people in your audience. First of all, they're going to, and actually this is the other thing with like calling people, they're going to feel good. They're going to post about it on social media. They're going to make you look great, right? Mm-hmm. And then they're going to attract other people. And it creates a relationship that is for life then.
You know, what's funny is like there's going to be some people in my audience that give a call to, and they're like, oh, hey, how's it going? And then they're going to hear this episode and they're like, oh.
Are you going to call people in your audience?
So there's already a couple people that I have in mind for sure.
Okay.
But I know I already talked to them a lot through DM. So that's another point that I would want to bring up. Is it the same? Is it the same if you are talking to people through messaging, or what you're talking about actually getting boots on the ground, and in this case through a internet wire or whatever, and talking to them physically? Is that a better way of doing it? So
I'll turn that question on you. Like think of the relationships you have that are just over text, and the ones where you've actually talked to people on the phone.
You know what? I'm already going to answer this because I've met a lot of these people in person via coffee at conferences or anything like that. So I would say obviously in person is the best way. Yeah. And then obviously if you can call, then call, then DMs and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think this is probably something that helped me is I would just read a lot when I was starting out. I read a lot of these stories. Actually, one that I can think of is Tim Ferris. He, and later on wanted to start like a venture-backed company and stuff, wanted to work at Foursquare, and he would like keep emailing those people at Foursquare just to be an intern, right? And I think it's him or someone else, but similar stories. And at some point they're like, okay, if you're going to be in town at this point, or if you're ever in town in New York, let us know. And he was like, oh, that's awesome. I'm actually going to be in town next week. So let's see you for coffee. And then he booked the ticket. And I've just heard so many stories of where like people just bought one ticket just for that 30-minute meeting that changed their life, that I think as much as you can do in person or on the call, like is helpful.
Oh yeah, for sure. I can count on my hand how many times certain things like that.
I mean, think about it. Like if one of your listeners was like, hey, I'm flying in from this city. Can I meet you for coffee? Are you going to say no?
No. Funny story. When I first started my podcast, and I had a podcast while I had my full-time job for a couple months. And then the week that I knew I was leaving my job, I scheduled as many podcasts as I could as possible. And there was one guest that I knew if I could get into LA, then I would buy the ticket. And similar conversation where I know I would like building this rapport with him. And then finally it's like, hey man, I'm coming out to LA. You want to do a podcast? It's like, sure, man. I was like, all right. And then bought the ticket.
And then you bought the ticket?
yeah, for sure. So yeah, case in point of exactly what you're talking about. Okay. So actual 2 questions at the end of the podcast. What's the best investment that you've had for yourself? Could be business, could be personal, in the last year.
I would actually say this goes back to the last 10 years is cultivating these relationships that I mentioned. Because
we're just I love how you keep everything in flow.
Every client that I've gotten, every kind of just problem I've solved has come through relationships, like going to conferences, going to events. Actually, this is another tip. A lot of people will think, oh, I can't go to these like big events and stuff, right? You can, because I've done it. When I was in SF, when I was broke, when I didn't have money to pay the bills, this is actually what I would do is sometimes I would wait for tickets to sell out, but sometimes I'd just do it. I would email the person at the conference and be like, hey, I'm starting out. I don't have money to pay for it. Can I just volunteer? And I remember like volunteering all of these conferences. So that's the first step, volunteer. Second is kind of like a little hack. I would try and be the volunteer who was taking care of the speakers. So I remember this one conference, I basically was the volunteer in charge of the speaker room. So guess who's hanging out with all of the speakers when they're just relaxing? Yep. This guy. Yeah. So just like relationships, and if you can't go to all of these conferences, if you can't go to the events, look up events in your city where the people you want to meet are speaking, and just try and volunteer there. Because that's the first thing you can do.
Yeah. The other thing I would give as advice, especially for one of the conferences that I highly recommend if you're a YouTuber, is Vid Summit. And at Vid Summit, this is another hack, is what you can do, and which I know a lot of people actually do, is they just don't go to the speeches during the day, but it's at hotels. So just hang out in the lobby during the night. And that's where all the networking happens anyway. So you could just kind of walk in and sit at the bar, because actual hotel guests are there, and nobody's going to be the wiser that if you're not wearing the badge or whatever. Yeah. But hanging out in the same place after the event has happened is perfect.
My friend Vanessa Van Edwards, who runs Blog Science of People, has an amazing story about that. She went to this conference and couldn't pay. So what she did was she went to the Starbucks next door and basically told them, hey, we're going to have like speakers coming in. I'm just going to leave money because I'm just going to get in line and buy coffee with them. So she was basically like waiting in the coffee shop. If she saw someone in line wearing a badge, she would go up to them and be like, hey, I saw you at this conference. Can I just ask like what you learned, and can I buy you coffee? And then she just did this over and over again.
Cow,
and just sat at the coffee shop.
So at Vid Summit, there was a guy that I met 2 years ago. I got in the line. It was a really long line for coffee. And then the next year, that same guy was like, hey man, do you remember me? I was like, we were in line at coffee like last year. And I was like, oh yeah. And then we could obviously talk about how we've progressed since then. But yeah, coffee line conversations are great, especially at events like that, because if there's only one coffee shop nearby, everybody wants coffee, but you're stuck in line for such a long time.
Yeah, it's just like, it's a great, anytime when people are waiting in line, except for the restroom, don't do it then.
Yeah. We did going back to the Chive podcast, another guest that we had was John Cena, and he tells a story about how obviously Mark Cuban, John Cena, both like amazing people. John Cena too, just like he wants the best.
I bet he's the nicest person in the world.
He wants the best for his fans. And the only thing that he said two things, is like, please don't come up to him when he's in the bathroom. And then two, like, if you are sacrificing your life to like wave at me across the street and like trying to cross traffic, if you see me in the car, like, that's not cool. Those two things, like, that comes up.
That means that's happened to him.
Yeah, which is like, it's sad, but yeah. Last question is, why do you do what you do?
I just like creating. I remember as a kid, I was an artist. I remember looking at a blank page and just doing art and turning something into nothing. And I think in some ways, I'm just still doing that. Just creating from scratch. That's
awesome, man.
Yeah.
So what's the name of your podcast, and where can people find you?
Yeah, so the podcast name, actually, we're still trying to figure out. But the URL is going to be creators.show.
If this podcast is out, I'll link it.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, just link in the show notes and stuff.
Well, cool. Awesome. And then can they find you anywhere else?
Yeah, if you want to find me on social media, it's SACHIT GUPTA. And if you don't remember that, we'll link it in the show notes. Because it's hard to spell. And yeah, just find me on Instagram, Twitter, wherever.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all the valuable information in terms of just like helping other creators out get monetized. Sachit,
thank you for having me, and thank you for all the work you're doing to help creators too.
Yeah. All right. Until next episode, if you would like to share this out, you could actually put the link on a piece of parcel and mail it to somebody, and then tag me on Instagram at Javier Mercedes X. Like I said, I'm going to keep saying that at the end of each podcast until somebody does it.
And if you tag Javier, he might give you a phone call.
Yes. I'll DM you to give you a phone call. Oh my gosh. Somebody's going to do it now.
It's going to happen.
Man knows what he's talking about. Again, thank you so much for your time. And until next episode, I hope you guys are out there living a life of abundance.